yesterday we talked about the actual. Oops, sorry. Okay, so we talked about the more about the writing of the Constitution. We looked at 3/5 compromise, and also just talked about some of the different things that the framers of the Constitution sort of built into the Constitution in order to create a government that was far more powerful, but that was also extremely limited, more limited in the kind of powers that it could exercise. So many people at the Constitutional Convention feel pretty good about it, but we must realize that there were also plenty of delegates at the convention that were not at all pleased with what they came up with. There were plenty that said, okay, this is probably the best we could do, but there were also some that said, this is not a good idea, and immediately go home and start campaigning against the Constitution. So all of that arguing, all of that debating, all of that deal making and compromise making and all sorts of things that we talked about last time, that's just the beginning of the fight. And so now a new fight begins, and that is the process of ratification. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, ratifying the Constitution. So the delegates spend the whole summer of 1787 locked up in that room in Philadelphia, ironing out all the details, arguing over everything they could possibly argue about. In September, they get a finished product, and that is the day that most of them, almost all of them, sign the Constitution. Some of them chose not to because they were so unhappy with the end result. But again, that does not mean that the Constitution immediately goes into effect. It is just a proposal at this particular point. They're just making a proposal, and now it goes out to the states. So now the states become the battleground as we now enter this new fight and this new argument over ratification. Ratification, or to ratify, that simply means to approve. Okay, to approve. So the ratification process is just the process of, well, I say just, but it is the process of approving the Constitution. And it is the states that are going to have to do that. And a certain number of states are going to have to ratify or approve of the Constitution before it can officially go into effect. In the meantime, the Articles of Confederation is still in effect. So, and that's one of the last things in the Constitution is how it would be approved, how it would be ratified. So not all of them, they didn't say all of the states had to approve. It's 9. The 9 of the 13 are going to have to say yes and agree to it. Why do you think the framers didn't want it to have to be unanimous? Why 9 out of 13 instead of 13 out of 13?
The northern states and southern states
Yeah, it's bound somebody's going to oppose it, right? You know, and they kind of said, we have to wait on this to be unanimous. We probably won't get it done. 9 out of 13 is more than a majority, so it's got to be, you know, an overwhelming yes, but not all the way yes. You know, they can have some dissenting going on there. States are going to have to call together a ratification convention. So they're asking states to actually form a convention within their state, kind of like what they did. You know, but instead of a convention of all of the states meeting, they have to call together one for their state, which makes sense. And it's kind of clever why they did that. They did not send it to the existing state governments and the existing state legislatures. They said you got to call together a convention. They were too afraid that if they sent it to the existing state legislatures, that they would definitely vote no, because you know, this Constitution does mean that those state governments are going to have to give up some of their power. And they figured that, you know, state governments wouldn't be incredibly willing to do that, so they're bypassing them. They're bypassing the state legislatures and say, form a new convention to look at this. And the ratification process takes about 2 years. So it's not quick and easy. It is quick and easy in some places. There are some states where ratification doesn't take very long at all. There are some that really just in a matter of a month or so will call together a convention and easily approve the Constitution. Interestingly enough, Delaware is the first one to approve it. That's why they call themselves, you know, every state has like a little slogan or like a little nickname they give themselves. Delaware calls itself the first state, and they say that because they were the first ones to ratify the Constitution. Then it starts to get certainly, you know, you get, you know, several of them ratifying the Constitution over the, you know, first year or so. But it really starts to get, you know, intense when you get to that point where, you know, you've got all but maybe 1 or 2 that you need. Remember, they only need 9 in order for it to go into effect. So when you get to that point that you've got about 7 or 8 that's when we start to see some of the most intense debating happening. Because, you're at that moment where you're about to cross that threshold to the Constitution that's going to be ratified. And it's also in some of those states where the vote was extremely close and it was not easily going one way or the other. You kind of have some holdouts. So particularly when it comes down to the pivotal moment states like Virginia and especially in New York, that is where things really got much more heated and the debate got much more intense and exciting, as New York was one of those states where, one, it was extremely close. It was not really close to one side or the other. It was very, very neck and neck between those delegates of their convention that wanted the Constitution and those that did not. And also New York was, they're getting close to that magic number. You're getting close to having the number that you're going to need for it to go into effect. And the idea is also that, if New York says yes, because it is a large state, it's sort of an influential one, I think you could make the case that a lot of other states would eventually follow them. So this is where we start to see a true divide really show up. That divide had really already been there, because from the beginning, you've got people that are for the Constitution or campaigning for it, and you have people that are campaigning against it. But it becomes particularly pronounced when New York is going through the ratification process. So we start to see two clear sides develop. People that are for it, people that are against it. And those two sides start taking on names, and it starts to become a true campaign, the same way that other political campaigns are conducted, with running all kinds of papers and essentially advertising and campaigning for or against. So the two sides are what we need to look at here. The first side in all of this is a group of people that start to call themselves the Federalists, or they start getting called the Federalists. The Federalists are in favor of the Constitution. So these are people who are in favor of the Constitution that want to see it ratified. Now the name Federalists, federal. What does federal mean again? National. So they get called Federalists because what does the Constitution do overall, generally speaking, to the national government? It empowers it. It made it stronger, and the Federalists like that. So the Federalists were in favor of a stronger national government. They wanted a stronger national government. They believe that's going to be better. Thus, they start getting called Federalists because they favor that stronger federal government. The Federalists are going to argue that this is going to be, yes, a more powerful government, but they certainly like to point out that it is still a limited one. They point out all those things about checks and balances and federalism and all that sort of stuff to say this is a government that's going to be able to get the job done. State governments are not going anywhere. Some things are changing, but this is a government that is still going to be limited, and it's a government that's going to be able to protect our interests. It's going to be able to grow our country and keep everybody safe. Federalists, and this is very much generalizing, this certainly is not true of all of them, but generally speaking, Federalists tend to be a bit wealthier. They tend to come from wealthier classes and wealthier parts of the states. So they tend to have more money. They tend to be bankers or business owners or people that own significant amounts of land. And again, that's generalizing. It doesn't mean that there weren't, lower to more, lower class people that weren't Federalists, but for the most part, they're overwhelmingly kind of that upper class. And therefore, they tend to come more from the Northeast. They tend to be more concentrated in the New England states and some of some of your upper middle Atlantic states. Again, that doesn't mean that there's not any Federalists toward the South, but there's certainly more of them the further north you go, because that's where most of the, I just said they were mostly, or a lot of them were bankers and businessmen and things like that. Most that's in the Northeast, so it makes sense that those two things would be related to each other. And then they also explain why the Federalists wanted a stronger federal government. How would you describe the economic situation under the Articles of Confederation? Very weak. The economy was falling apart. The inflation was bad and there was no money. There was a great concern, and a lot of historians make the argument that the upper class people like them, the wealthier folks, were very nervous about that. They did not want the value of their property, the value of their businesses, the value of money. All of those things did not bode well for them. And, so they wanted a stronger federal government. in order to have more control over the economy, in order to improve the economy, and therefore improve or maintain even their financial status, their all those kinds of things. So whether or not you think that makes them good or makes them bad, it's probably true. They thought that the economy was out of control and they wanted to better control that. So Federalists tend to be wealthier, and they overall support the new Constitution and want it to be ratified, and they'll be campaigning for it. Then you have the other side of the argument. Pretty easy to remember what we call them. People start calling the other side of this argument the anti-federalists. Who do you think the anti-federalists are? They don't want the Constitution. Yes, these are people who don't want the Constitution that are campaigning against it. They are opposed. So they are encouraging their states or their conventions and all of that to vote no on the Constitution. Anti-federalists, the name just kind of sticks because they are opposed to the Federalists. It's really kind of not the most accurate of names because it's not that they're opposed to the concept of federalism. They don't necessarily oppose the idea of having some sort of national government, but they do oppose this particular one. The anti-federalists overall argue that this is a government that's going to be too powerful, that they have overdone it, and that this federal government is going to be too powerful. And therefore, they're sure that this national government is going to do what with that power? Abuse it, yeah. That this is going to be a government that's going to go around and abuse that power, that it's going to take away power from the citizens, that it's going to take too much power taken away from the states. They want to see the states retain a lot of their power the way that it had been under the Articles of Confederation. So they would, again, they're not necessarily opposed to the idea of a federal government because the Articles of Confederation was a federal system too. They both are. It's just a question of power and size. This is a much bigger federal government and much more powerful, and the anti-federalists do not like that. So they are certain that this is going to be a government that will abuse that power. They also argue because the biggest concern, though, that the anti-federalists have, they say that a lot, but kind of one of the things that becomes sort of their sticking point, their big talking point, probably their number one grievance with the Constitution, is that there was no Bill of Rights. They are very, very worried about the fact that there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. What do we mean by a Bill of Rights? What would that mean? Yes?
A document showing their rights.
Yeah, some kind of written document or written part of the Constitution that says all citizens have these rights, like the right to a trial by jury and the right to, protection of your property and, right for freedom of the press, all that kind of stuff. They saw that as being particularly important. Why would these people think, other than the fact that, okay, they want those rights protected, why else would they want that in there?
Because they remember what happened in Britain, and they don't want that happening.
Exactly. They're thinking of the example they just came from. Remember, again, these are also people that just a handful of years before this were British citizens. Did they have a Bill of Rights in that case?
No.
English Bill of Rights, they did. So they see that as incredibly important. And they're very disturbed and very distressed at the fact that there's no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And they're certain that if there is no Bill of Rights actually listing out the rights that the government cannot violate, then it is a definite thing that the government will violate those rights. Now, most states have a Bill of Rights, but they're upset there isn't one at the federal level, and that's the thing that they continually go on and on and on about. The anti-federalists, again, this is very much generalizing, so this is not true of all of them, but the anti-federalists tend to be less wealthy, so they tend to be more from your middle to lower classes. Now, there were certainly plenty of wealthy anti-federalists. Otherwise, no one would be really speaking for them. But they tend to get most of their support from lower classes, smaller landowners, poorer people. And therefore, the anti-federalists, and this is generalizing, but they tend to be more concentrated in more rural areas, more southern states, more western areas, places that are not as populated as many cities and all of that. So more in the south, western frontier, smaller landowners, smaller property owners, people that were a little less wealthy. And that brings in another sort of an underlying issue here is that there's a bit of sort of class difference here, almost like class warfare here, and that's an argument of the anti-federalists. Because when they think about this national government that they're trying to create here, and we think about the people who are going to be elected to Congress, the people who are going to serve as judges, the people who are going to serve as senators, the person who's going to end up as president, whatever. What kind of people are those most likely going to be in these days? It's probably going to be wealthier individuals, isn't it? It's going to be, people with money, people with education, people with property, all that sort of stuff. More like the Federalists, okay? And so the anti-Federalists are also making this argument of, it's the rich people that are going to run everything. This is a scheme by the upper classes. It's a scheme by the businesses. It's a scheme by the banks to take power away from the small farmer, to take power away from, the poor people, the little folks, And that's not what a true republic is supposed to be. Republic is about power to the people. Republicanism is about power to the average citizen, not power in the hands of an elite, wealthy upper class. And they feared that's what was going to go on here. The Federalists might not exactly have argued against that. I think they would have probably argued against that being, of malicious intent. But I think you can argue that maybe kind of was their purpose. Think about things like Shays' Rebellion. What kind of people were they? The poorer farmers, the kind of lower classes, more folks along the lines of your anti-federalists. And the Federalists did believe that those people could not be trusted. And they saw something like Shays' Rebellion as proof of that, to say we have to strengthen the national government to protect us from that kind of mess, because we don't want anarchy, we don't want mob rule, we don't want violence. So we've got to create a system that is stronger, where the more enlightened bunch that are not going to do those kinds of things can make decisions in a more rational way. So again, essentially it's for Constitution against Constitution, but you need to understand why, what the issue was there and the differences between these two, and how that leads to their position on the Constitution and on this new stronger national government. So particularly, like I was saying, in the state of New York is where we start to see this get particularly heated, because in New York it was very, very close. And New York was kind of one of those really pivotal states, because it's sort of like if they can get New York, if New York says yes, then they are, not guaranteed, but much closer to guaranteed to getting the Constitution ratified. So here's where we see both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists launch intense campaigns to try to persuade New York's ratification convention one way or the other. And so this is where we will see the publication of what become called the Federalist Papers. So these were originally published in the state of New York. Originally the audience was in New York, but it's one of those things that ends up having importance far beyond what it was originally intended to do. So the Federalist Papers, this is a series of essays, a total of 85 of them. Essays written by some of the more prominent Federalists, with the purpose of trying to gain support for the Constitution. They are writing all these essays explaining and defending the Constitution, trying to put this out there to say this is why the Constitution should be approved, why it should be adopted. Many of you know the writers of the Federalist Papers. James Madison obviously is one of them. We should assume definitely that he's a Federalist. He practically wrote the Constitution, so he's most certainly going to be, in favor of it and be a leading Federalist. John Jay is another writer. John Jay, J-A-Y. He writes a small number of the Federalist Papers. And of course, Alexander Hamilton, who was Federalist and Federalist. He wanted a much stronger national government than they ended up getting. So those three work together, and they plan all this out. They each kind of have their area of expertise, where they sort of are assigned to write particular papers. Madison, for example, writes mostly about the legislative branch. John Jay is kind of an expert in, or more of an expert in things like foreign policy, so he deals with a lot of that kind of stuff. And over a course of several months, they publish these papers. They're published anonymously. What does that mean?
They don't know who
They had like a pen name, and that was common at the time. So I don't think it was like let's be secretive so no one knows it was us. That was just sort of typical for any sort of political writing, was that you wrote stuff and used a pen name of some kind. But we know who wrote which ones. There's some Federalist Papers. It's a total of 85 books. If you grab a copy of them, and it's about that thick. There's a lot in there. And there's some that we kind of consider more important than others. There are some that are certainly more famous than others. The ones that tend to be the most famous ones, the ones that, whenever you're in government, all that kind of stuff, you'll end up reading. Usually some of Madison's. He kind of writes the ones that get the most attention. But again, the purpose is to gain support for the Constitution and all of that, which it does have that effect. But another thing that the Federalist Papers end up doing, probably what the writers of the Federalist Papers weren't intending to do, is it ends up also, giving us a deep, deep, deep analysis of the Constitution from the very people who wrote it. A very deep understanding, a very deep play-by-play description and analysis of why the framers put certain things into the Constitution, what they were thinking, why they thought this was good or that was good, all that sort of stuff. So it ends up, it kind of starts out as this campaign sort of thing to convince people of something, which it does have that effect. But it ends up being incredibly valuable now as just a tool for understanding the Constitution, that we have this thing. And it also shows the style and the intellect of the Federalists. Now, there is a series of essays that we call the Anti-Federalist Papers. So the Anti-Federalists were actually doing a similar thing. However, going through writing essays to say what was wrong with the Constitution. Here's all the things that are bad about it. Here's all the ways that it's going to cause a problem, so forth and so on. However, that was not as organized as the Federalist Papers were. The Anti-Federalists were overall not very organized. So those Anti-Federalist Papers were not a joint effort the way that the Federalist Papers were. That Madison and Jay and Hamilton intentionally got together. They planned this out. They decided who was going to do what. It was all from beginning to end a coordinated effort. The Anti-Federalist Papers are not. It was just this person and then that person and, just kind of spouting off whatever it was they felt like. We tend to group them together, and you can buy them in a book called the Anti-Federalist Papers, but it was not an official project the way the Federalist Papers were. Which again brings us to another big difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and that is that the Federalists are far more organized and far more united than the Anti-Federalists were. We'll get back to that again in a moment, but the Federalists have a much more clear message and a much more clear understanding of what it was they believed and why they believed it. Now, eventually New York does ratify the Constitution, and eventually we do get, ratification, but it is still not as neat and clean as we want to think. It's interesting to realize, if we realize, the Constitution today, I think you could easily make the case that it's a pretty unifying document. Most people probably have very positive feelings about the Constitution. It is something that kind of emotes a lot of patriotism in people. Now, people disagree greatly on exactly what they think the Constitution means, on the interpretation of it. But the document itself, it seems like, whatever side of the political spectrum people are on, they're always pointing to the Constitution as their backup for why they think what they think. Again, they might interpret it differently, but it tends to be a very unifying thing. But it's interesting to realize that the Constitution was not unifying when it was written. We saw how difficult it was just to get the thing written because everybody disagreed on things. Then it takes nearly 2 years to get it approved. And when it comes down to it, most people that even approved it weren't 100% enthusiastic about it. It kind of comes down to, for a lot of folks, well, it's better than what we've got. We can't keep doing what we're doing, and this is our only option, so let's give it a try. It wasn't exactly, let's all be united and together. It wasn't near as unifying as it is now. It's actually incredibly divisive rather than the other way around. But ratification process continues. As I said, it takes about 2 years. In 1789, they finally get the final states that they need. New York and Virginia were kind of the last ones that they needed. And it is ratified and then goes into effect in 1789. So again, until then, the Articles of Confederation was still in effect. And again, it still took compromise. The Anti-Federalists are still not very happy, and it did it took some scheming, some sort of unofficial compromising on all of this to get it ratified, to get some of those states that weren't exactly happy about it, that had some reservations and some concerns, to get them to agree. What did we say was the biggest concern of the anti-federalists?
No bill of rights.
Yeah, no Bill of Rights. Do we have a Bill of Rights? Yes, we do. There's the compromise. Is essentially what happens is the Federalists agree to add a Bill of Rights later on. They say, we will add one once this all gets done. So the Bill of Rights, again, that was a huge source of debate regarding the Constitution. And something that the Federalists tried to argue that it wasn't necessary. That was their position on it, was that we don't need it. There are enough checks and balances and things like that in the government that it's not necessary to spell it all out like that. But the anti-federalists are still digging in. So in the end, this kind of becomes the unofficial compromise. It's not like they, sign an agreement or anything. But in the end, most of the Federalists kind of agree, all right, fine, if you will just support this now, if you will just give us your yes vote now, we promise that once this new government is formed, that once we get past ratification and we get started, we get rolling, one of the first things we will do is add a Bill of Rights. And they make good on that promise. So one of the very first things that happens after ratification is when that very first Congress convenes, is they will draft what becomes the Bill of Rights. So it is not done till it's, in addition. But the Bill of Rights, specifically, it's the first 10 amendments. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. What again are amendments? Changes, okay? The Constitution, in 200 plus years has only been amended 27 times, and the first 10 were right there in the first couple of years. So it's pretty interesting that it's only been amended that many. The Alabama Constitution, I think, has been amended more than 2,000, and it's about 120 years old. So the Bill of Rights, and most of them, those first 10 do pertain to specific rights. We're going to kind of run down the list. Now, I'm not going to ask you specifically exactly what's in the 5th, what's in the 7th, exact wording, any of those things. You kind of need to just have a general understanding of the general kinds of things that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights as a whole, but you're not going to have to know first, here's the next, second, third, real specific like that. You'll probably do that in government in the 12th grade. So again, just a general idea of overall the kind of rights that are included in the Bill of Rights is what we're going to look at now. Not necessarily, I'm not going to give you a right and then ask you to pick which amendment that is. You'll probably have to do that, when you're senior. But a lot of this you probably know. So the First Amendment, that's probably, I would guess, I think you can make the case that that's probably the most well-known. I bet if you walk down the hall today and ask somebody about the First Amendment, they could probably tell you something about it and probably be correct. What are some things that are guaranteed in the First Amendment? Yes. Okay. Very good. So religion. So right to practice of religion. That's also has what we call the Establishment Clause that prevents the government from establishing any sort of religion. So a separation of church and state, as well as protecting people's right to practice a religion or have a religious affiliation. So freedom of the press. What's the press? Media, newspapers, and then later, of course, that would include, TV media and all that kind of stuff. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, to protest or say something that is contrary to what the government says, those sorts of things. Now, we know, of course, there's limitations and all that. Those are big questions that are constantly being asked. You'll look more at that in the 12th grade. Freedom of assembly, what's that mean?
Freedom to gather.
To gather, whether that means if you're having a protest or it could just mean freedom to associate with the kind of groups that you want to associate with the, to be a member of certain organizations, things like that. So that one, covers a lot of ground, and that's the one that you'll see probably the most, controversy around and different questions about exactly how far that goes and things like that. Second Amendment, which one is that? Yes? No. Sorry? Huh? Okay, right to bear arms. Wanting to make sure that states would continue to have the right to defend themselves and create their militias and those sorts of things. Third is kind of a one that we look at, and sometimes it looks kind of strange. A lot of times we look at it and go, what is that in there? But if we think about the context of it, it'll make more sense. The third is the one about quartering of troops, that the government can't force you to like keep troops on your property during time of peace. Why do you think they put that in there? Yes.
Because of the war.
Yeah, that had happened to the colonists during the Revolutionary periods, and that was something that was in the English Bill of Rights that they thought was important, and they wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. The Fourth Amendment has to do with okay, what's your raising your hand? The Fourth Amendment has to do with searches and seizures. You know, this is where the stuff like search warrants and all that comes from. All that has basis in the Fourth Amendment. So, you know, your property can't be searched or taken without due process and probable cause and all those sorts of things. You know, search warrants aren't, you know, necessarily listed there, but that's where the idea comes from. It has its basis there. The Fifth, have you ever heard anybody on TV or in the movie say, I plead the Fifth?
Yes.
What do they mean? What are they saying?
Meaning they don't want to, like especially in a court, they don't want to say anything.
Right, they're right. That's the whole right to remain silent thing, which the Fifth Amendment does not say that, but that's where the idea comes from. It protects you from what's called self-incrimination, to say something that would incriminate yourself. So this is where the no coercion, all that stuff, and again, the whole concept of a right to remain silent, that you don't have to say anything if you're not the one, you know, that might incriminate yourself if you're the one who could possibly be incriminated by something like that. 6 and 7 both have to do with trials. This is where you get the right to a trial by jury, right to a fair and speedy trial. That's covered in both the 6th and the 7th Amendments. The 8th is the cruel and unusual punishment one, barring states or anybody from any cruel, unusual punishment. And, you know, this is a good example of ways that, you know, amendments are interpreted differently throughout time, and they're interpreted differently by different governments, by different states. You know, there are things that were not considered cruel and unusual when this was passed in 1791, I think is when this goes into effect, that might be considered cruel and unusual now that we've gotten away from. There are some states, you know, that allow certain things and other states that don't because it's a difference of interpretation. So sometimes, you know, the Constitution doesn't necessarily change, but the way it's understood can change or be different from one group or another. The 9th is one that's not very well known. A lot of people would probably struggle to articulate what exactly is in the 9th Amendment, and that's because it's not specific. It does not mention a specific right. Yes. Okay. So the 9th Amendment is sort of like a catch-all, I guess you could say. It basically says that your rights are not limited to what's in the Bill of Rights. That just because they did not mention it in 1 through 8 doesn't mean that you don't have that right, that there are other rights that they may not have spelled out. So this one obviously can become quite controversial. Exactly what does that mean? This is where arguments for things like a right to privacy and all that come from, because there is no amendment that says that, but the precedent for that comes from the 9th Amendment. Madison thought that one was particularly important. The 10th Amendment we'll talk about a lot later. The 10th Amendment actually does not deal with rights to individuals. It actually talks about rights to the states. This is the basis, or sometimes this is called the States' Rights Amendment. And this is, you can really hear some of the concerns of the anti-federalists in this one, where it basically says any powers that they didn't grant to the national government, didn't grant to the federal government, are reserved for who? The states. So basically saying, we didn't put it in here. It's not a job of the national government, then the states have it, which is interesting because it kind of contradicts some other things that are in the Constitution. So we'll talk about that debate a little bit later. And that 10th Amendment is going to be particularly important to those groups and those individuals and those states that will later argue for increased states' rights, because we're going to see a lot of conflict still between states and federal government and that sort of thing. Okay, so the Constitution goes into effect or is adopted 1789, and we have a little bit more to talk about just the different branches. We're going to look at tomorrow a little bit more about the different powers of the government, the structure of the Constitution, some of the stuff you're already looking at in that packet, and then we'll spend chapter 6 looking at how all this moves from being a bunch of words on paper to a living and breathing, functioning, working government, how that actually happens. Okay, so any questions on that? Okay, so what we need to do now is let's get back out. Hold on just a second. our worksheet packet that we're doing.